Today, I want to share a story so deeply human it challenges everything we think we know about strength, set in the unforgiving West, where storms reveal who we truly are. This is a world shaped by loss, fear, and unexpected mercy, where two broken paths are about to cross. It all starts with one fragile moment, small enough to be overlooked, yet strong enough to awaken identity, memory, and belonging. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The camp was called Hollow Creek, a scatter of tents clawing at the earth, two warped cabins braced against the wind, and a chapel so weather-beaten it looked ready to fold with the next hard storm. It was a place shaped by men's hunger for gold and women's silence. Lena Hart had learned early how to vanish while standing in plain sight. She kept her voice soft, her chin lowered, her hands never still. She cooked, she swept, she hauled water until her shoulders ached. Anything that kept her from being noticed. In Hollow Creek, survival meant making yourself useful and invisible. Her mother, Martha Hart, had died when Lena was still young, leaving her in the care of Grady Hale, the man who called himself her stepfather. To Lena, he felt less like family, and more like a collector of debts. A man soaked in cheap whiskey, stitched together with small lies and even smaller courage. He had dragged her west chasing fortune and found only failure, then blamed the world for it. That winter, the sky hung low over Hollow Creek, bruised and heavy. Smoke from pine fires burned the air, and the wind cut sharp as regret. Before dawn, Lena swept the chapel tent with her shawl pulled tight, believing the day would pass like all the others. It did not. From behind the cookhouse, she saw Grady speaking with Boone Mercer, the mine foreman. Mercer was tall, broad-shouldered, hard in the way men get when they've never learned to listen. His black coat snapped in the wind as he leaned close. Lena couldn't hear the words, but she saw enough. The crooked smile on Mercer's mouth, the way Grady's eyes slid away, too ashamed to meet his. Later, Grady found her hauling wood. He didn't shout. He never had to. His voice, low and rough, cut deeper than anger. "Put on your blue dress," he said, not looking at her. Her hands froze on the pile. "Why?" He turned, gray eyes flat. "Don't ask me that again. Wash your face. Tie your hair back proper. We've got company tonight." Her stomach twisted. Still, she obeyed. She always had. That evening, inside the supply tent, thick with smoke and oil lamp shadows, Boone Mercer sipped brandy and looked at her like a thing priced and measured. "You're a quiet one," he said with a thin smile, snake slow. "That's good. A man wants quiet when he comes home." Grady sat with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't touch the drink Mercer poured. He didn't say a word when Mercer mentioned the timber rights Grady still held. The bargain closed without another breath. Lena's throat tightened. The blue dress itched at her neck. Her mother had stitched it years ago, back when there had been music in their home, back when laughter still lived there. Now it was only a costume for her betrayal. That night, after the camp fell quiet, Lena returned to the bunkhouse. The other women slept, but she sat awake in the dark, clutching her mother's locket, worn thin by years of worry. She remembered Martha's voice, soft and steady, telling her there was always a choice, even when the world tried to convince you there wasn't. In that silence, Lena understood the truth. If she stayed, she would be sold. So she chose. She gathered what little she owned, a torn shawl, a few small things, and held them tight as her hands began to shake. She took a small knife, her mother's locket, and tied them together in a scrap of cloth. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she was about to risk. Then she slipped into the night. Snow cracked under her boots as she threaded between the tents, keeping to the deepest shadows. Each breath burst white in the frozen air. The wind tore at her dress. The cold bit within minutes, sharp and unforgiving. Still she pushed past the edge of camp. The forest rose ahead, black and silent. Spruce trees crowded the trail. She followed an old game track east, climbing toward the ridgeline. An owl cried once, then went quiet. Somewhere nearby, a fox paused to watch before disappearing. Lena Hart's fingers burned with cold, her lips split. She wanted to stop, to rest. But she knew if she did, she might never stand again. She forced herself on until she found a hollow at the base of a boulder, half sheltered from the wind. She crawled inside and folded in on herself, knees drawn tight. Clutching the locket, she didn't pray, at least not in words. She whispered her mother's name once, like a vow. Then, sleep came. Dangerous, heavy, the kind that feels like sinking through snow, slow, endless, soundless, far above, where the ridge opened onto a white, empty world. Someone watched. He did not move at first. He stood still as stone, boots buried deep in the drift. His eyes were dark and keen, his hair bound with leather, a hunter's bow resting across his shoulder. His name was Cale. He had read snow his whole life, countless tracks, but never any like these. These were the marks of desperation. A young woman running not from hunger, not from wolves, but from men. When he saw the locket clenched in her frozen hand, the red thread tied in the old knot of remembrance, he understood. This was no chance crossing. The fire of memory had found her, and he would not turn away. Lena pushed through the trees, breath tearing from her in sharp white bursts. Each step rang loud in her ears, though the camp behind her stayed silent. She did not look back. One turn of her head might summon Grady Hale's voice, Boone Mercer's hand, closing the trap tighter. So she fixed her eyes ahead, heart pounding, every beat a plea that her trail would go unseen. The night showed no mercy. Snow blew sideways, driven by a wind that sliced through her blue dress as if it were paper. The shawl at her shoulders stiffened with frost. Her hands burned with pain, then dulled into the numb terror that warned of frostbite. Still she pressed on. Better the storm than the men she'd left behind. The forest swallowed her. Black spruce leaned close, branches heavy with ice, needles whispering in the restless wind. The moon broke through the clouds now and then, laying pale silver on the path. But the comfort never lasted. Mostly there was only darkness, and the rasp of her own breath, fast and shallow. At last her body failed her. Her knees gave way. She fell hard into the snow and lay there, cheek pressed to frozen earth, lungs heaving. Tears stung her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the brutal cold. She would not stop. She could not. With shaking fingers, she pulled the bundle tight to her chest and forced herself upright. She staggered on until she reached the shadow of a boulder jutting from the slope, where the wind had carved a shallow hollow. She crawled inside and curled small, drawing her knees in close, holding on. She gripped her mother's locket in one hand. It was so cold it seared her skin. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her breathing broke into short, painful pulls of air. She shut her eyes and whispered her mother's name. Just once. Half a prayer, half a plea. Sleep slid over her like snow piling on bent branches. Slow, quiet, almost gentle. Her body sagged against the rock, her fingers loosened. The locket slipped free. It swung on its thin chain, the red thread woven through it catching the moon's pale glow. Far above her, On the ridgeline, where the trees thinned and the land opened into a white, endless horizon, a man watched. His name was Kyle. Tall, broad through the shoulders, he blended into the timber in his buckskin cloak, a bow resting across his back. His dark hair was tied with rawhide, his eyes sharp, trained to read every sign the land ever left behind. He had followed tracks his whole life, deer hooves, fox prints, the dragged lines of rabbits in fresh snow. He knew them all by shape, by weight, by depth, but these tracks were different, smaller, uneven, staggered, the marks of a young woman running not toward something, but away. He followed them without hurry, step by deliberate step, until he reached the boulder where she had fallen. He did not approach at first. He stood still. His breath drifted white in the night air, his gaze fixed on the figure curled in the hollow. She was shaking violently, nearly gone. Her lips were pale as ash. Then he saw it, the thing that rooted him in place. The locket, worn brass, plain, but tied with a loop of red thread, knotted in a way he knew as well as his own name. His grandmother had tied thread like that long ago, when the people whispered the names of those taken, of those lost. A thread not meant for beauty, but for memory, a promise that those swallowed by silence would not be forgotten. Kyle felt his chest tighten. This girl, this stranger. She carried the knot of his people. He did not know how or why, but he knew this much. Nothing like this happened by accident. The storm screamed along the ridge, scattering fine powder over his boots. The forest groaned beneath the weight of snow. He glanced once toward the camp below, the faint orange glow of fires still burning in the hollow. Then he looked back at the girl, Lena Hart. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew the choice before him. Walk away. Leave her to the cold. Let her story end here, unheard, or step forward and change both of their lives forever. Kyle did not move right away. He stood, testing the weight of the night, listening to the wind, listening to memory. Then, with steady resolve, he started down the slope. When Lena stirred again, it wasn't to the roar of the storm. It was to the sound of fire, warm, faint but real. Heat brushed her skin, her lashes fluttered open, and the world swam into focus. A low ceiling of rough-cut logs, shadows quivering along the beams, smoke curling toward a narrow vent above. Beneath her cheek was fur, real fur, thick and musky. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dreaming, carried somewhere strange by the snow. Then the pain returned, the ache in her limbs, the sting of cracked lips, the deep, burning throb in her feet. Not death. Life. Pain meant life. A voice reached her, low, steady. Don't move too fast. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs as she turned her head and saw him, the man from the ridge. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wrapped in layers of buckskin and worn wool. His black hair was pulled back with rawhide. His eyes were dark, closed off, giving nothing away. When they met hers, they didn't soften, but they carried none of the hunger she had learned to fear in men. His stare held steady, not pressing, not taking. You need rest, he said. Lena Hart tried to answer, but her throat was bone dry. She swallowed, dragged her tongue over cracked lips, and forced out a whisper. Who are you? He crouched beside the fire, feeding a stick of wood into the coals. His voice came rough, like bark peeled from an old tree. Kyle. The name settled into the lodge like smoke, solid, unmovable. He reached for a tin cup near the flames, poured warm water, and held it out. Lena's hands shook as she took it, the heat biting into her palms. She drank slowly, careful not to spill. Each swallow eased the desert ache in her throat. When the cup was empty, he rose and crossed to the far wall where bundles of herbs and strips of dried meat hung from wooden pegs. His steps made no sound, as if the lodge itself recognized him. Lena pushed herself upright, blinking hard. That was when she noticed her boots were gone. Her feet were wrapped in soft cloth that smelled faintly of cedar. Panic surged. She pulled the blanket tight around her legs. He sensed it without her speaking. "Frostbite," he said simply. "Would have taken half your toes if I'd left you." She stared at him, unsure whether to trust words so blunt. But the truth weighed heavy in her bones. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't taken anything. He had kept her alive. "Where am I?" she whispered. He glanced back. "High Ridge, south face. Storm hit last night. You wouldn't have survived out there." Pride flared. She wanted to argue, to say she might have made it, but every bruise and cut knew better. She lowered her eyes to the fire. "Why?" Her voice shook. "Why did you help me?" Kyle turned then, crouching in front of her. In his hand was something small, her mother's locket. "This was on you," he said, holding it out. Lena's breath caught. She grabbed it, pressing it tight to her chest. The red thread looped through the chain glowed faintly in the firelight. "You know what that knot means?" he asked. She shook her head. "It was my mother's. She never explained. Just tied it this way. Said it helped her remember." Kyle's gaze darkened, not with anger, but recognition. "My grandmother tied thread like that, for those taken, for those lost. A promise that silence wouldn't win." The fire cracked, sparks lifting toward the smoke hole. Lena turned the locket in her fingers, feeling the roughness of the thread. "My mother died when I was 10, she said softly. She never talked about where she came from. She only sang songs. I didn't understand them." Kyle studied her face for a long moment. He said nothing. Then his voice dropped, nearly a murmur. "Maybe she wanted you to remember without words." Lena swallowed. Warmth spread through her chest. Grief tangled with something fragile. Hope. Silence settled between them. Outside, the storm still raged. Wind battered the logs. Snow hissed across the roof. Inside, the fire held steady. "You'll stay until it breaks," Kyle said, standing. 2 days. Maybe 3. Lena nodded faintly and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Gratitude sat uneasy beside caution. In her life, nothing had ever been given without a price. And yet here she was. Alive! Because a stranger had chosen not to turn away. As the night pressed deeper, she sank back into the furs, watching Cale move through the shelter. He spoke little, only what was needed. He stirred a pot of stew with measured care, sliced strips of hide, tied herbs into neat bundles. His days were shaped by silence and survival. And she understood then that he was a man who required very little. Still, he had not left her in the snow. Before sleep took her again, Lena whispered into the quiet, barely loud enough to carry. "Why do you live out here alone?" He looked straight at her, his face giving nothing away. "Same reason you ran," he said. "Some places ain't safe for people like us." The fire snapped. The wind howled. Lena closed her eyes. For the first time in years, even with fear still lodged in her bones, she felt something unfamiliar, fragile. She felt safe. The storm did not break quickly. It leaned hard against the lodge, wind screaming through the pines, snow clawing at the hanging door skin. In weather like that, days could stretch thin and endless. But inside, time shifted, moving by another measure. Lena woke to the smell of smoke and meat simmered with herbs. Kyle was already awake, already working, his movements spare and exact. He wasted no words, no effort. Everything he did served a purpose. When she reached for the pot to stir, he watched her closely. "Not yet," he said. "Too soon, you scorched the bottom." She pulled her hand back, half embarrassed. Then she lifted her eyes. "Show me." So he did. Patiently, he placed a flat stone in her palm, set wild tubers before her, showed her how to cut them clean. His rough fingers brushed hers once, only once, adjusting the angle of the blade. Nothing more. The space he kept was deliberate, respectful, and it startled her. Because respect was not something she had heard spoken in years. They worked side by side in silence until the stew thickened and breathed out rich scent: rabbit meat, tubers, wild carrot, and the sharp bitterness of a green leaf she didn't recognize. When she asked, he told her its name, his voice holding no pride, only memory. Later, Kyle showed her the jars tucked into shelves carved from stone. Inside were dried leaves, twisted roots, hardened powders. He handed her one jar marked with a streak of red ochre. "For fever," he said, lifting a curled root. He tapped another. "For pain." His knuckle pressed lightly against a strip of bark. "And this for bleeding. You remember these?" "They remember you back." Lena repeated each name under her breath, committing them to memory. She had never been taught that the land itself could heal. That remembrance lived in roots and leaves. When weariness crept into her bones, Kyle set his knife aside and reached for a small leather pouch. Inside was a fine gray ash, scented with cedar. He pinched some between his fingers and scattered it into the fire. The flames flared gold, then settled into a deep, steady red. Lena's breath caught. "What is that?" After a pause, he answered, "Spirit ash, burned cedar, herbs, sometimes pieces of our dead." He watched the fire as he spoke. "It's ceremony, it's memory. Fire doesn't lie." He let the words hang. "It remembers what we give it." Lena stared into the coals, glowing calm and unbroken. It was as if the fire had taken something sacred into itself. Lena thought of the locket pressed against her chest, of the red thread Martha Hart had tied there, without ever explaining why. A knot she now understood was older than any truth her mother had spoken aloud. And then the memory came, sharp, as though it had been waiting in the dark for this moment. Her mother in Kansas, standing at the hearth, stirring a pot while humming under her breath. The tune had never been English. Not hymn, not lullaby, not anything Lena could name. She remembered asking once what it meant. Her mother had only smiled, a sad, distant smile, and said, "Old things." Now, with the fire whispering in front of her, Lena hummed those same broken notes, soft at first, uncertain. The melody lifted into the lodge, weaving through smoke and shadow. Kyle froze. His eyes rose from the antler he was carving. He didn't smile, but his gaze drifted far away, as if pulled across years he rarely touched. When the last note faded, he spoke. "My aunt sang that," he said quietly. "My mother, too." Lena's lips parted. "You know it?" He nodded once. "Apache, an old song. Not all the words survive, but the memory does." The lodge seemed to hold its breath. Snow groaned against the walls, the storm pressing in. Inside, there was only silence, and the weight of what had just been uncovered. "My mother," Lena whispered. "She never told me, never said she was Apache. But what if she was?" Kyle studied her for a long time before answering. "Blood carries what words forget," he said. "Songs don't travel by accident." Lena tightened her grip on the locket. Her throat burned with something between grief and wonder. For years she had felt unrooted, unseen, as though her life had been nothing but quiet endurance. Now she glimpsed a thread tying her to something larger. Songs, knots, fire, memory. And Cale's presence made that thread visible. As the storm deepened outside, Lena stayed close to the fire, watching him carve the antler into small tokens. His hands were steady, every cut deliberate. He said little, but his silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like an opening. When she found the courage, she whispered, "Why do you trust me?" He didn't look up. His answer came slowly. "I don't." Her heart faltered. Shame crept in, and she lowered her eyes. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You don't lie, not to me. That matters." The words settled over her heavier than the furs around her shoulders. For years she had learned to be small, obedient, invisible. Now, here in this lodge, in the heart of a storm, someone had met her with truth instead of command. The fire burned low. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, something else stirred. Not trust, not safety, something thinner, more fragile. The first spark of belonging. The storm held for 2 more days. Inside the lodge, the fire never went out. It was their anchor, dimming when sleep pressed heavy, flaring bright when Kyle fed it pine or cedar. Lena watched the flames as if they mirrored her own heartbeat, rising, falling, never steady, never still. That night, Cale sat cross-legged by the fire, a strip of wood in his hands, carving with the edge of his knife. He hadn't spoken much since morning, but Lena had grown used to his quiet. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissal. It was a language. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and spoke before fear could stop her. "When I lived in the camp," she began, her voice thin, "I learned the only way to survive was to be small." To do as she was told? To keep her head lowered and speak only when spoken to. She had believed obedience would protect her. Instead, it erased her. The confession burned its way up her throat. She braced herself, expecting him to turn away, or worse, to agree. He didn't. Kyle set the piece of wood aside and looked at her fully. His dark eyes didn't flinch, didn't drift. They held her steady until it nearly broke her. "You didn't beg," he said at last. His voice was rough but sure. "You burned." The word struck like a blow. Lena's lips parted but no sound came. Burned. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever looked past her silence and seen something fierce still alive beneath it. Her throat tightened. Still, she forced the question out. "Is that what you saw in me? Fire?" Kyle's gaze didn't soften, but it deepened, as if he weighed every truth before giving it. "When I first saw you in the snow," he said, "I thought you were already gone. But you held that locket like it was a flame, even frozen." He paused, jaw tightening. "You were still holding on. Fire remembers. And you—" Another pause. "You refused to go out." Lena pressed a hand to the locket at her chest. She wanted to believe him. Part of her was still that terrified girl slipping out of camp, shaking with every step. But another part, the part that whispered her mother's songs into the fire, knew his words carried truth. She leaned forward, voice low. "I don't know who I am anymore. Not the girl I was before my mother died. Not the one I became under Grady Hale's shadow." She swallowed. "Now I'm something in between." Kyle studied her longer than before. Then he spoke, his tone softer than she had ever heard. "You're not in between," he said. "You're becoming." The fire popped, a spark shooting up the chimney. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lena felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something fragile and unsteady. Hope. She had spent years making herself smaller just to survive. And now, here was someone telling her she was more than survival. Cale turned back to his carving, but his voice lingered in the air. "When you look at me," he said quietly, "I forget how long I've been alone. I forget why I chose it." Lena's breath caught. She pulled the blanket tighter, not against the cold, but against the storm inside her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked. His hands paused over the knife, knuckles steady. He didn't lift his eyes. "I've lived with ghosts so long, I thought I was one of them," he said. "But when you sit by the fire and look at me like I'm not a shadow, I remember I'm still here. Alive." The lodge fell impossibly quiet. Lena could hear the wind rattling the pines, the hiss of snow on the roof, the steady crackle of the fire. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast, uneven. For years she had feared men, their hunger, their demands, their hands. But Kyle was different. His silence was different. It didn't swallow her. It gave her room to breathe, to remember, to exist. Slowly she whispered, "Then maybe you were never meant to live as a ghost." He looked up, and in his eyes she saw not softness, but something rarer, truth. It burned as fiercely as the flames between them. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The space between them held more than hands ever could. In that silence, heavy with memory and fragile hope, their bond took root. Lena leaned back against the wooden wall, her eyes drifting shut. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. And beside the fire, Cale remained in his quiet. He wasn't just carving wood anymore. He was shaping a place where two lives, once broken, once drifting, had begun to form something new. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind felt heavier than the snow. Morning light spilled pale and cold across the ridge, flashing against frozen pools and ice-crusted branches. Lena rose early to gather kindling near the spring, her breath ghosting white in the air. Her steps were careful on the brittle ice. Kyle was repairing the roofline, threading rawhide through split logs with slow, practiced movements. Then a sound reached them. Low, distant, steady. Hoofbeats. Kyle went still, one hand braced against the logs. Lena turned sharply. The sound grew clearer, measured, confident. Whoever was coming did not ride with fear. 3 horses broke through the trees. Their riders wore dust-stained coats. The man in front sat a black gelding, lean-faced and sharp-eyed, a shotgun resting loose across his lap. Another rode close behind him, broader in build, revolvers heavy at his hips. The third walked beside his horse. Lena recognized his gait before she saw his face. Grady Hale. Her mouth went dry. He looked thinner now, hollowed out by drink and failure. But his eyes carried the same emptiness. Desperate, dangerous. He hadn't come to beg. He had come to take. The riders dismounted. The lean man, clearly the one who spoke for them, stepped forward, his voice smooth with false ease. "Anyone inside? I suggest you come talk," he called. "We're looking for a girl, Lena Hart, blonde, about so tall." He gestured lazily with his hand. "Ran off from her lawful family. We're here to bring her home." Inside the shelter, Lena clutched her locket until the chain bit into her skin. Kyle stood at the doorway, arms folded, silent. Grady stepped forward then, his voice rough as dry rope. "She's my daughter. Ain't nobody's business but mine." Kyle's expression didn't change. He stepped outside, standing tall in the pale morning light. When he spoke, His voice was calm, steady, low. "She's not yours," the spokesman chuckled, tipping his head. "You the Indian keeping her warm?" Kyle didn't blink. "She came here free," he said. "She stays free." Grady's jaw twitched. Shame flickered across his face. She belongs with family. Kyle took a single step forward. His voice hardened, sharp as steel drawn from fire. "You sold her." The truth hung between them like smoke. Grady shifted, mouth opening, then closing. "It was a mistake," he muttered. "We're here to fix it." The third man began to drift wide, his hand resting near his pistol. Kyle didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed locked on the leader. "Turn around," Kyle said. "Go back down the mountain." The spokesman smirked, trying to wear confidence like armor. "And if we don't?" Kyle's voice didn't rise. It cut the air, low, final. "Then you'll learn what the fire remembers." Before the man could answer, the forest moved. From the shadows of the pines, figures stepped forward, silent, sure-footed. An elder woman emerged first, her hair braided white as snow, elk hide wrapped around her shoulders. A bow was drawn in her steady hands. It was Elda. Behind her stood 2 hunters, the red wolves, their eyes sharp, their presence grounded. A boy followed, no more than 12, a slingshot carved with feathers clutched in his fist, one of the little pines. More shapes appeared behind them, not an army, but enough. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten. They stood with the weight of the land itself, unmoving, unyielding. The lead rider cursed under his breath. "Damn ghosts coming out of the trees," Grady faltered. He stepped back, his face wavering between rage and fear, but no words came. Kyle didn't turn his head. His voice carried backward, level, clear. "Lena." Her heart hammered, but she moved anyway. She stepped out of the lodge into the pale morning light. Her face was drained of color, yet her chin stayed lifted. She held her locket in both hands, the red thread bright against her skin. The spokesman looked her over, contempt thick in his voice. "You sure you want to stay out here, girl? Ain't no law protects you in these woods." Lena answered, her voice shaking, but unbroken. "You're right. No law does." She tightened her grip on the locket. "But memory does. My mother's blood does." She met his eyes. "And I will never be yours again." Grady Hale's mouth twisted. "You were mine. Your mother and you." Lena's gaze hardened. "No, she was never yours, and neither was I." The elder woman stepped forward then. Elda's voice moved through the clearing like wind through stone. "She is blood. She carries the ash. She remembers the songs." Silence fell, heavy, absolute. The spokesman spat into the snow. "Keep her. Ain't worth the powder." He swung onto his horse, turning it toward the trail. "Come on, Grady. Your girl's gone." Grady hesitated. His eyes flicked to Lena one last time. For a breath, the past wavered between them. Years of fear, silence, debt. Lena did not look away. She did not lower her head. She held his gaze until, finally, he turned. The riders vanished into the trees, their hoofbeats fading down the ridge. Only when the forest settled did Kyle release a slow, low breath. Elda laid a hand on Lena's shoulder. "You did not run," she said. "That is what matters." Lena felt her knees tremble, but she stayed standing. For the first time in her life, she had not hidden. She had not obeyed. She had stood. That night, the fire burned brighter than it had all winter, not for warmth, not for fear, but for ceremony. Lena Hart, once unseen, once sold, stood within the circle of memory. Her place was no longer in question. Spring did not rush the mountains. It came quietly, as if testing whether the land would allow it. Snow thinned along the lower trails, revealing dark earth and brittle grass. Pine needles scattered where wind had stripped the branches bare. Even so, a fire was lit in the clearing near the hot spring. Not for warmth, for remembrance. Lena stood at the edge of the circle, her breath shallow, her heart steady and unsteady all at once. She wore a simple tunic dyed with clay and ash, stitched by women who had asked nothing of her but her hands. Around her neck hung the antler carving Coil had given her, a small flame, polished smooth. Her hair was braided into 2 plaits, laced with red thread. The people gathered, few but firm in presence. Elders with faces lined like riverbeds, children with berry-stained lips and curious eyes, the little pines, hunters, women, the old and the young. Each carried something: herbs, bark, carved stones, small offerings placed gently by the fire. At the center stood Elda, her white braids falling over her shoulders, her palms lifted to the sky, fingers spread like wings. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and strong. "Today," she said, "we name what has returned." She paused, letting the fire breathe. Many forget what blood carries. They believe paper holds power. They believe written names speak louder than breath. But memory remembers, and fire remembers. Elda turned toward Lena Hart. The circle fell silent. The wind stilled, as if the mountain itself leaned closer to listen. From a small pouch, Elda drew a shawl dyed in the colors of earth and sky. At its center, a flame had been stitched in orange thread, ringed with pine boughs. "The ridge carries memory," Elda said. "The fire carries truth." She laid the shawl across Lena's shoulders. It was heavy, scented with cedar. It carried both. A hush moved through the circle. Then Elda spoke the name. Ash. The sound lifted like smoke. Some said the name meant eternal bloom. Others said it meant the one who stays. Both were true. Its deeper meaning, ember, glowed beneath it. Lena swallowed, her chest tightening. Slowly, she whispered the name herself, tasting its weight. Ash. The people answered not with cheers, but with nods, with the soft beat of drums, with voices humming low. A song rose, old, steady, threading through the trees. A small boy, no more than 5, stepped forward shyly. He offered her a bundle of pine needles wrapped in cloth. His hands trembled, but his eyes shone with trust. She bent to accept it, her fingers brushing his. He smiled once, quick and bright, then ran back to his place. When the song faded, children gathered near her, faces lifted, waiting. Without thinking, Ash opened her mouth and hummed. The same melody her mother had once carried through their cabin, the same one Kyle had recognized by the fire. The notes wavered at first, fragile as a bird lifting from the ground. Then they steadied, grew strong. The children leaned closer. Some swayed. Some echoed the tune in soft voices of their own. Ash smiled through the ache in her throat. For years the song had been locked in memory. Now it lived again, carried forward, no longer hers alone. Kyle watched from the edge of the circle, silent as ever. His dark eyes stayed on her, but he did not step forward. He didn't need to. He had brought her this far. Now the fire itself had claimed her. When the final note dissolved into evening, Ash felt a stillness inside her she had never known. She was no longer the frightened girl in the blue dress, no longer the unseen shadow of Hollow Creek. She was Ash, ember, remembered, belonging. For the first time in her life, she no longer carried the weight of being unwanted. She carried the weight of a name. And it was enough. Spring did not rush the mountains. It arrived carefully, as if asking permission. Snow thinned along the lower trails, revealing dark soil where green shoots pushed upward. The air lost its iron bite and carried the sweetness of thawing earth and cedar sap. Ash walked barefoot across damp ground, her hands filled with wild mint and sprigs of cedar. She had learned the names of plants, learned to listen for the stories they carried. Her steps were sure now, no longer a runaway trembling at shadows. She was a woman who chose to stay. Near the hot spring, she knelt to wash the herbs in warm water, steam rising into cool air. The shawl rested on her shoulders, its stitched flame bright at the center. She wore it not as burden, but as memory. Ash, the one who stayed. That evening, as the fire burned low outside Elda's lodge, Kyle came to her. He carried something wrapped in leather, folded with care. His face, as always, revealed little. But his eyes held the steady truth she had come to trust. He placed the bundle in her hands. For you. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a bracelet of carved bone beads, polished smooth, strung with turquoise and cedar. One bead bore the shape of a flame, etched with deliberate care. Her breath caught. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kyle nodded once. "Fire remembers. And so will you." Her fingers closed around the bracelet, its weight grounding in her palm. For years, she had carried only her mother's locket, a symbol of loss and silence. Now she held something new, something born not of what was taken, but of what had been given back. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "I don't know what I did to deserve this." "You stayed," he said simply. The fire cracked, sparks lifting into the dark. They stood together in silence, the mountain breathing around them, stars waking one by one. Then Ash whispered, almost to herself, "I wasn't rescued. Was I?" Kale's eyes never left hers. "No. You returned." And she understood. She had not been saved like something fragile carried from danger. She had chosen, endured, stood. She had claimed her life, and in return, she had been given more than survival. She had been given belonging. She had been given love. She had not been rescued. She had returned. In the mountains, among the Apache, Lena Hart became ash, ember. She found not just shelter from the storm, but a place where memory lived, where fire remembered, and where her name was hers to keep. And now, finally let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.